Hey, everyone. We are going to get started in 1 minute. So, welcome. Welcome to building HATEOAS into your API. So first of all, my name is Eugene. I run a site called bildung.com. And for the most part, I build APIs, and mostly with Spring, but of course not only with Spring. Some of these API actually are starting to get Hypermedia right, and not just starting to get it right, but get the full benefit out of Hypermedia. Because for the longest time, there were benefits for implementing Hypermedia, but not the full benefits, not the full things that you can actually gain by doing it. So the goal of this talk is essentially to show you how Hypermedia is important for the API, how it can help in practice and not just marginally. And then, of course, we're going to move quickly to a good way to actually implementing Hypermedia with Spring HATEOAS. It's essentially a talk that I wish I would have heard about a few years ago when I was starting to do Hypermedia. So let's get started. We are going to introduce HATEOAS. If you have been working with HATEOAS, I'm going to move quickly through this initial part, the introductions and why we need to do it. And we're going to get to the practical stuff. We are then going to talk about JSON and Hypermedia and how that relates to JSON and the various solutions on the market that actually try to add Hypermedia on top of JSON. We're then going to see how all of this simplifies the client and why making the API discoverable helps us to build better clients. And of course, then we're going to talk about implementation details. So we're going to talk about implementations with Spring HATEOAS, and we're also going to look at a few advanced stuff in Jackson. Like advanced stuff meaning stuff that can help you build better APIs, help you move less data over the wire, help the clients ask just for the data that they actually need, things like that. All right. So first of all, Hypermedia stands for the HATEOAS acronym, which is a terrible acronym, unfortunately, and it's pronounced in a variety of ways. I'm personally calling it HATEOAS. It's Hypermedia as the engine of application state. You can pronounce it however it feels natural, but yeah, it's not a great acronym. The point of HATEOAS is essentially to drive the client through the states of your system. The real point is to move all of the business logic to the API side of things, to the server side of things, and keep that out of the client. So as much as possible, keep all of that logic out of the client. So in theory, if you read like the actual doctoral thesis of Roy Fielding, in theory, APIs should have absolutely no documentation. Documentation would be considered out-of-band state, out-of-band information, and essentially that should not be present in an API. Now, of course, that's the theory. In practice, APIs are not there yet. They're not there yet in terms of mostly standardization, right? So if you look at the standardization that HTML has, HTML is there. So you can build browsers, you can build clients that rely on the rich standard that HTML has, and you can pretty much rely on that standard. Now, APIs and all of the other part of the ecosystem is simply not there yet. However, we're not going to be bogged down into kind of non-constructive stuff, right? Like discussing the fact that if an API has a swagger attached to it and you're documenting it, well, that's not really RESTful. We're not going to be bogged down into that kind of discussion. We're basically going to talk about the practical aspects of actually building APIs for clients, actually doing this stuff in practice. And that's what we care about. And this is not an all-or-nothing type of approach. So it's not like either you do Hypermedia and you have like an entirely RESTful, fully RESTful API or not. No, you can get a lot of advantages by following some of those concepts, not all of them. So let's go for a simple example. How do we buy a book from Amazon? Well, the first thing we do, we find the ISBN of that book. We then go to the Amazon documentation. We find the book URL pattern, right? We use that ISBN. We form the actual URL of the book. We do a get. We get the actual JSON of the book. We go back to the documentation. We look for the add to cart operation. We do a post. We trigger that add to cart. So it's a convoluted process, as you can see, right? You go back to the documentation. You look for the buy operation, now that the book is in the cart. And finally, you post, and you trigger the buy operation. So is that how we buy a book from Amazon? Well, not really. If we were to buy a book from Amazon like that, we would probably not buy a book, ever. This is not how we use the web, right? So the reality is that we use the web in a different way, in a much more natural and simple way. But the problem is, this is what it would mean if we had an API for buying a book without any sort of hypermedia. Instead, what we do is we navigate to a book page, we click a link, we add the book to the cart, and we click another link, and we buy the cart. That's it. That's how we buy a book. So that is, a simple example that encompasses the idea of driving your client through this flow with links. That is the idea compared to the convoluted process of going to the documentation, going back, forming URLs. That's the raw approach. So what's the common thread here? Well, obviously, it's the links. So the links are the common thread, and the links are the driver of this entire flow. So very simply put, hypermedia means embedding links into your responses, into the responses of your API. Now, more theoretically put, a hypermedia type means that you need native hyperlinking semantics in that type. So, for example, HTML, right? HTML has hyperlinking semantics. It has the A element. So that's the way you form links. Now, how does all of that help the client? Well, for the first kind of few years that I was doing hypermedia, I was trying to do hypermedia, I missed some of those points. I got right some of the points, but missed some other points. And this is essentially, with trial and error, with experimentation, with actual client implementations, what I found and what we as a team found, basically, that hypermedia helps, in which area it helps. So first of all, it helps because you now have standards. You now have some conventions that you can rely on. And with those conventions don't change. Now, those may be standards, right? But they may not be standards. So standards would be great, but of course, standards are not there yet. So some of those conventions are not going to be necessarily part of a standard, that are simply going to be internal conventions for your own system. But they're still conventions, and they're still things that do not change often. So the client understands those conventions, because either it's your internal client or you're exposing those conventions in the documentation, and so the client understands the conventions, and then it uses those conventions to navigate the system. Now, how does that actually work? First of all, what that does is that it moves all of the business logic out of the client, or most of it. Not all of it in all cases, but most of the business logic is now on the server side. All of those links, all of those transitions are calculated and are essentially built on the server side, and the client side can just display those links. So the client knows the conventions, and it displays whatever it gets from the server side. That way, basically, the APIs can be evolved much easier. So APIs can be evolved without breaking clients, even if you have an internal client. Like, for example, I worked in projects where the internal client, the front end, was built, of course, by separate teams, and many teams were building the same thing. So coordinating deployments, coordinating all of the orchestration from, OK, we have to deploy an API in production, from we're breaking a client, we need to deploy that as well, becomes really difficult. Even if it's an internal client, that usually becomes quickly difficult as soon as you have separate teams working on it. If you're talking about third-party clients, then of course it becomes even more difficult. And the final thing, and this is the part that I got a while back, it makes the first experience of a client really good. And this matters a lot when you're dealing with third-party clients. It matters a lot when essentially someone else needs to integrate with your API, because your API is probably not the only API in the market that does that particular functionality. And so if a developer from a separate company has to write an integration, what they're going to do is they're going to try to prop up a simple proof of concept. And if your API makes that easy, if your API means that they don't have to follow through 100 pages of Swagger documentation, and instead it makes it super easy, super clear what that integration looks like, well, then they're going to probably pick your solution. If not, they're going to move on. So this is really important for this first run experience, the first experience that a developer integrating with your API actually has. All right. So now that was my, that was for many years, that was my own question. When I started to see that this actually works and how it works, this is the most common question I get, like, does this actually work in practice? Like, OK, that's fine. You're driving the client through the experience. That's all good. But does it actually work? Like, is it actually in use? And we have used it in client implementations for a number of years now, about 2 years. And it does work. But it works with some caveats. It's not like you implement Hypermedia into your API, and all of a sudden, your clients are never broken, and you pretty much can do anything you want. No. So it's definitely a common question, and it's definitely a legit question. All right. So what's the missing link? Well, the missing link is that when you're building the client, it cannot be business as usual. It cannot be you're building a client and the API happens to do Hypermedia. No, the client needs to adhere to the Hypermedia. It needs to actually utilize that as it needs to treat it as a first-class citizen. So that was the major shift that we had to do, and that kind of was the major thing that we weren't doing for a long time. And that's why we weren't seeing the benefits of Hypermedia. As soon as we started building parts of the UI, parts of the client, around the fact that we have those conventions now, and we know what those conventions mean, as soon as we started to do that, we started to see that a whole class of problems, a whole category of changes that were previously breaking changes, so they would break the client if we did them, and whenever we did a change like that, we had to deploy the client with the API together. Well, as we started to do that, we started peeling away some of those. Like, we started identifying some changes where, oh, we don't actually have to deploy the client because the client is fine. Even though we changed something that in the beginning would have broken the client, no, the client is fine for that particular change. And that's the way we did it. So it's the way we did it. Bit by bit, we identify classes of changes that we could now do and we couldn't do before. And it was a gradual process. It was never a thing like we had Hypermedia and all of a sudden we could really deploy those things separately. And even now, there are categories of changes, there are classes of changes where we have to do simultaneous deployments. There are changes where it doesn't really matter if you have Hypermedia or not. If the change falls in that class of changes, you can still you still need to coordinate. Now, if we're talking about public type of UIs, like let's say Amazon, because we've talked about Amazon, right? Pixel perfect things, you get the design. It's not an internal application. It's actually a public site. The things that work well here is identifying predefined areas, like dynamic areas of content where you can actually utilize the Hypermedia. Most of the UI is fixed, and it's pixel perfect, and of course, it needs to be like that. But there are areas in the UI, usually, and for example, in Amazon, there are lots of them. Like, for example, you have the recommended area, right? That scrolling bar in Amazon. Well, that's not pixel perfect. That's dynamically populated. You have for example, also bot, right? That's another area where even though the full design is a public design, that also bot area is something that can be dynamically populated and can get the benefit of Hypermedia. So that's what works best for public-facing APIs. It's identifying those areas where this actually makes sense. Now, for management style of apps, like for admin style of applications, other things work well. First of all, it's more of a, you have an easier way here. You don't have necessarily pixel-perfect screens you have to actually adhere to, so you now have more flexibility. So what works here is, of course, action bars, overlays, navigation. All of that stuff can be dynamic. So when you identify those areas of your application that can be dynamic and can actually use like actions, for example, you can always add another action. Up to a point, of course. But you can basically add another action. You can add another item into the navigation. You can essentially utilize it where it makes sense. So that way, this question of, like, does it actually work becomes much clearer. Because the real answer is it depends, like most other things. All right. So now I'm going to do a quick session where I'm going to actually go through an API, go through this book buying process with an API that is on GitHub. The link is going to, of course, be in the final slide, so you feel free to just play around with that. But for the time being, let's actually pull that on the screen. Second. And let's play around with it. All right. So this is, of course, just an example. It's not meant to necessarily have, like, let's see. OK. It's an example of what would this look like. Like, if we had to implement it with Spring HATEOAS, what would this actually look like? OK. So for example, we're going to explore the root of that API, right? We're just going to do a request and get the root, right? We want to explore this API as if it's like fully Hypermedia, because it's a simple example, so I have the advantage of not having like actual client requirements, so I can make it fully Hypermedia, even though that almost never actually happens in practice. The point is to see how this works, because when you understand how this works, you're going to be able to pull certain things from it and actually put those things into your API where it makes sense. All right, so we went on the root, and we're getting back these links, right? So we're getting two links. We're seeing that we have a Books API that we can explore, and we have a Cart API. OK, so let's see. First of all, what do we want to do? Let's try an options. Let's see what this Books API actually allows us to do. Right? We're going to do an options. Spring MVC handles options by default. So that's pretty cool. You don't have to do anything to get options. And we're seeing that we can do a get. We can do a post, and of course, the head. Now, let's do the same thing for the cart. This is the perils of live coding. OK, so what we can do here is a get, a patch, a delete, and a post. OK, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to actually see, we're going to do a get on the Books API, right? We want to see what books we have in the system, and here we go. We have a few books. We're getting back this JSON. It's pretty big. Of course, these are just 3 books, but in a real system, you're going to get a lot of them, probably some pagination as well. In our case, we have this book JSON, and we have some links. OK. So let's go for one of those books, right? We see the self-link of each book. So let's just do a get on one of them. Let's do a get and see what we get back. One second. OK. So we did a get, and now we see some interesting things. First of all, we see the self-link. So that's cool. We're going to talk about the self-link in a second. But we also see this add to cart operation, and we get the link to the cart. Now, we did an options on the cart, and remember, we could post there. So we're going to try to post the book to this URI, right, to the cart URI. OK. All right, so we have a post here. We're posting a book, and we're getting back the cart. So we're getting the self-link of the cart. We're getting the receipt. If we buy it, this is where the receipt is going to be. And we see that we have some books in the cart. And the reason we have some books is that I was playing around with this application earlier, and I have not reset the system. So we have some books because I added some earlier. OK, so now we have these books. Let's actually buy this cart. So how do we do that? Well, we notice that purchased flag there, right? And this is a REST API, so we need to essentially work with the resource of the cart. So what we're going to do here is we're going to turn that flag on. Of course, this is a simplistic way to purchase a cart, right? We just say purchased equals true. But the point being, we want that resource to be purchased. That's what we need to get to. That's the end state. We need that resource to be purchased. And the reason we use a patch is we want to do an update with just a partial part of the cart. We don't want to send the whole cart over the wire. We just want to send the purchase flag. That's it. So let's have a look. So here we go. We're doing the patch. We're saying purchased is true. That's pretty much it. And here we go. We purchased it. We can see that the purchase is now true. And essentially, we purchased the book. We now can navigate to the receipt if we want to. Of course, we don't want to, because that's just a mock API. But the point is, if we now want to evolve this API, if we now want to not only show a receipt, but maybe we want to show an upsell. Maybe we're Amazon and we just purchased a book. And actually, this was happening in Amazon years before. They were selling the book. They had this purchase receipt, the URL. That's all they did. Now, at some point, Amazon bought Audible. And they had audiobooks. So all of a sudden, now you have an extra thing to sell to the purchaser, right? To the person that bought your book. You can sell the audiobook of that book. So that's essentially evolving the API. If you're evolving the API by just adding extra services, you can add links here. And now, all of a sudden, you can guide your customer to another part of the system. Because now you have another option, right? You have the option to sell an audiobook, for example. Well, that's as simple as just adding the link there. You don't have to change the client to display that upsell, because you're adding the link in your response, and of course, the client will display those responses, for example, as actions, right? Buttons or whatever it uses. Amazon, I think, just uses like the thumbnail of the book. So that has been my live coding example. Let's go back to the presentation. One second. OK. All right, so this is the adoption of HATEOAS. Right? So this is starting to pick up in 2011. It's now clearly on a high upward trend. So it's a good indication in terms of like the adoption of HATEOAS, and not only the adoption, but the fact that we're actually going to start seeing public APIs. For the time being, all I have personally seen is internal APIs that utilize HATEOAS to make these things more decoupled. I have not seen public APIs that actually do this well in practice, but they're coming. All right, so let's now add some links, and let's talk about JSON and Hypermedia. So are we using a hypermedia type? That's the first question we need to ask ourselves now that we want to add hypermedia, right? So if obviously HTML, we discussed it, it is a hypermedia type. Now, is XML a hypermedia type? It's not. It does not. It doesn't have any native hyperlinking support. It doesn't have any concept of a link. So XML is not. Unfortunately, neither is JSON. JSON has no concept of a link, not by itself. So that's a big problem, because most APIs will give you back XML or JSON. So can we make JSON hypermedia? That's the question. Well, it turns out that we can certainly make it hypermedia. We have tried to make it hypermedia in a lot of attempts. So we have HAL, and this is what Spring HATEOAS uses and Spring Data REST uses. So we are going to focus on HAL, but let's see. Why I was saying in the beginning that standardization is not yet there is because even when it comes to JSON, and even when it comes to this hypermedia layer built on top of JSON, we don't have a standard. We have many, many competing standards. So collection plus JSON, it's another one. Siren is another one. This actually goes one step further and adds some extra semantics like actions into the representation. JSON LD, JSON for linked data. This essentially, the point of it, it promises that you can move to it without breaking changes, which is pretty cool. It's pretty cool because if you're not doing an API from scratch, it matters a lot if you can actually move to a hypermedia-enabled type without breaking your clients. Now, we have JSON-API. This is the fifth one, right? This is a highly opinionated one and a really good one. And it has some clear defaults. It has a lot of defaults and kind of opinions about how you should interact with your API, what HTTP verbs and things like that you should use. But the problem is this is the fifth one. And we're not done. We have Uber, Mason, Yahapi, and CPHL. So you can clearly see why this is starting to get a little bit ridiculous from the point of view of standardization and from the point of view of just having like one standard or maybe one that actually wins in the market and then actually building clients on top of that standard. Because that's the point, right? That's why HTML won. That's why we have browsers, because there's one way to do it. All right, so we can definitely do better than raw JSON. We're going to go with HAL. The reason we're going to go with HAL is, again, because Spring uses it, and of course, it's a great solution. However, just keep that in mind that we do have many competing standards, and support for some of them is coming to Spring, like JSON API. So support for JSON API is at least in Jira, like the idea of it, and it's being discussed. And as far as I remember, I think JSON LD was kind of another alternative that you could probably use with HATEOAS, but again, not there yet. All right, so let's start introducing Spring HATEOAS. We saw it in practice. We saw an actual example of it. Let's actually start introducing it. So Spring HATEOAS, very simply put, it helps you build links into your responses. It's a pretty simple library, and the cool thing is that it is a library, so it's not necessarily going to take over control. It's something you can control. You can add those links however you want to. It supports HAL, as I was saying. Let's now introduce a simple, just introduce it into the project. Of course, Spring HATEOAS is the way to do it. If you're using boot, we're not even specifying a version here. You can start with a boot starter as well. Pretty simple to introduce. Now, what is the first step to actually build this into your existing API? Because if you're starting from scratch, then you're in a lucky position. However, most of us are not starting from scratch. Most of us, if we want to use this in our current projects, we have to find a way to actually bake it in. We have to find a way to migrate what we have to actually utilize Spring HATEOAS. The first thing you can do is you can extend resource support, and that's going to give you essentially the whole support for Spring HATEOAS. So linking support and a few other nice things. Now, if you're transitioning an existing API, you can also wrap your existing resources. You can wrap those, and this is how it would look. So you can wrap them, and you can just transition your existing resources and your existing controller layer into using the new type of resource. And I've done this a few times. It's really self-contained, meaning it takes a few days, even for a large system. It's not that much work to do, because you're not really changing any logic. You're simply changing the return types of your controller methods, and you're essentially just changing some minor things. So even for a large API, it's not super difficult to do. Now, the nice thing is that you have another way to wrap your resources. So you could do it like this. You could do it like extend the resource. So you don't even have to declare the field. You can basically benefit from this wrapper that Spring HATEOAS provides. And that's it. So once you do that, and once you return this new resource from your controller layer, that's it, from the point of view of the migration. Of course, now you don't have any links. You're not benefiting from it, but at least you have the support to start adding links. So now let's actually start adding some links. All right, first of all, this is how a controller would look like. So before, you would have just the return type of a book. Now you're simply returning the book resource, and the very last thing you're doing is you're wrapping your existing book into the resource. Again, very simple. So this would be a simple book representation without any links. And now we're going to add a link. We're going to essentially add our first link, and this first link is going to be the self-link. Now, why is the self-link helpful? Because in simple examples, you would think that the self-link is redundant. You don't really need it. It's maybe a nice to have. But the reality is the self-link is super helpful in a few situations. The problem is that the resource is not always accessible on a single URI. The resource can be accessible as an embedded resource inside another one. It can be accessed through a parent. So it could be accessed in a variety of ways, not just in a single clean URI. So because of that, adding the self-link will basically point you to the canonical way to access the resource. Even if you're seeing that resource, as a child of another resource, that's OK. But you can still go to the root of it. You can still go to the canonical link of that resource. So that's why it's helpful. For simple examples, not really helpful, but as soon as you're starting to navigate an API that has child resources, has embedded resources, all of that stuff, as soon as you do that, you start seeing that, oh, the self-link is actually helpful. You can actually point to it, and you can see where the resource actually originates from. So let's see how we can add a link. So we had our book. How do we do it? Well, we could do it like this, right? We could do it with just the full URI. The problem if we do it like this is, of course, that's not going to be, that's going to be hard-coded. If we do it like this and we happen to deploy on localhost, that's great. But what happens if we deploy on something else or we change the port? So obviously, we can do better than this. OK, so the next step is we can link to the current mapping. Right? We can link and benefit from the fact that the current context knows what the host and the port are. And we can then say /books/ESBN. OK. So what's wrong with that? Well, the problem with that is that we are reproducing the mapping. We already have the mapping, right? We have the mapping in the Spring controller. We have the controller layer. We've defined all of those mappings. And we are simply doing that again here. So if those mappings change, we have to remember to change this link as well. Not ideal. Well, the good thing is that this is a Spring project. So it has a deep integration with Spring MVC. And Spring MVC has a way for you to retrieve all of those mappings. It has a way for you to get all of those handler mappings without having to redefine them. So So instead of manually building these URIs, we're going to point to a controller method instead. That's the cool thing about this being an actual Spring project and having this deep integration with Spring MVC, is that it allows you to point to a controller, and when you're doing that, you're benefiting from all of the mapping information that's already in your system. You're not redefining that. So let's see how that looks. So this would be a simple way to do it. We can point to the book controller, and we can then just say /ESBN. So we don't have to, we're basically one step closer, but we're still saying /ESBN. We're still basically putting some mapping information there. Well, this is the final solution. This is how we can do it without having any sort of mapping information. So we can not only point to a controller, but we can point to a method on that controller. So that's the deeper integration that, of course, when that happens, Spring HATEOAS will go into Spring MVC, will pull the mapping not only for the controller, but for the method itself, and will then create the right kind of link without any sort of mapping information. So this is how it will look. This is how it looks with the self-link. You have the book, and now you have the self-link right there. All right. So now the self-link is out of the way. That's pretty simple. Let's add another link. Let's add this add to cart link, the one that we saw when we explored the API. Because, by the way, all of this code is the code that is available on GitHub, and is the one we just explored. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to point to the cart controller, and we're going to add this book to the cart with the relation add to cart. Now notice that we're not using a standard relation. We are using a relation that is essentially, it's just a custom relation. That's why I was saying that the standards are not there yet. The standards do define a lot of rel types, however, not enough. Like, there are a lot of use cases where you have to define your own rel type, and that's perfectly fine. Of course, I'm mentioning this because if the standard happens to define a rel type that you can actually use, that's a better way to go. So if the standard already defines it. So this is the JSON plus the new link, right? This is the way that would look with the self-link, and now with this add to cart link. So basically, we're starting to see how these links are starting to shape up. All right. So this was a recent addition, and this was actually supposed to go before the interaction. The point here was to kind of drive into the interaction. So we're going to skip over because we've seen the interaction. And now we're going to start looking at some advanced use cases. So we've seen how to embed those links. We've seen how to try to separate all of that logic from the client and move that into the server and move that into the API side of things. Now we're going to look at some Jackson stuff, like some Jackson recent additions that have made operating with APIs and operating with a lot of JSON data much cleaner and much easier. So our book implementation is relatively simple, right? We have 5 fields in it, not a lot. The problem is a real book implementation has a lot of fields. I was looking at what that looks like when I was preparing for preparing the material, and the real book information would look like essentially it has about 40-something fields. So that's pretty large. And if we get all books, if we don't get a single book but we get all books, well, that's going to be a huge JSON. That's going to be a huge payload. If you do that with a mobile client, that's even worse. So the point being, we want to see how we can actually pick and choose. We want to be able to give Jackson enough information to give us less data, for example. That would be good, right? Give us less data when we're getting all of the books, and give us the full book representation only when we're getting a single book. All right. So let's see how to do that. Well, we're going to use JSON Views for that. And the simple way to do it is we can define a view. So in this case, we have this summary view. And then we can use that view just on the fields that we want to be part of that view. So if we've defined this summary view, we now want to say, OK, the ESBN is part of the summary view, because it's a critical part of the book. But maybe the synopsis of the book is not part of it. Maybe other fields, other less important fields are not part of the summary. What we can do then is we can use the JSON view annotation. We can basically enable this view on the find, in our case, on the find all implementation. And we are done. With that, we're going to go from this would be a full JSON, to this. So you have the full JSON. You have a much lighter, much cleaner JSON. OK, that's good. The problem is we're lacking some control. We actually want to control what we get. We don't just want to have like a simpler view. That's definitely a good point to start, but we want more control over that. So what do? Well, what we want here is, again, not just this predefined representation. We want to pick the fields that we get back. So for example, say that we're populating a table. And when we populate that table, we want to decide as a client, because the client displays that table, we want to decide exactly what fields are shown. So we want to only get those particular fields from the JSON, from the API. So this would be ideal, right? It would be ideal if I could say /API, /books, /ESBN, or even for all books, and then field equals title. I just want the title. I don't want the author. I don't want the synopsis. I don't want that whole huge JSON payload. I just want the title. The way to do that is with a JSON filter. So this is super helpful if you're dealing with clients that have, basically mobile clients or just lightweight clients that cannot handle a lot of data. And it depends, of course, on each individual scenario. So if you're not dealing with a lot of data in your payloads, that's probably not something you necessarily need to do. However, if you're dealing with some resources that are huge and have a lot of data, and you're also returning lists of those resources, well, all of a sudden, this becomes like really, really important. All right, so the implementation isn't that complicated. Of course, it's a little bit more cumbersome, so you have to define this filter provider, and you have to filter out all of the fields except the ones that the client has asked for. So in our case, if the client has asked for a title field, well, that's all that it is going to get. You're going to filter out everything else, and you're going to be returning just the title field. So essentially, that is helping Jackson shape the representation, and essentially giving Jackson enough information to do that. All right. So that's basically the way to do it in the controller layer, right? So you have all of that logic with the filtering, and now you're returning this mapping Jackson value. It's a simple wrapper, but it will allow you to do this kind of highly targeted filtering. And all of a sudden, instead of getting a huge payload, or if the client maybe needs to add a column into that table, they can just ask for the column. So they don't have to, you don't have to change the API to now return that column because the client needs it. No, the client can simply ask for it. And all of a sudden, you're separating the deployment, right? You can deploy a new client that asks for that field, but you don't have to deploy the API. So this is what I'm saying. It's another, for example, another class of changes that where you're breaking those two deployments and you don't have to synchronize them. All right. So this is basically how it would look, and that is the correct result. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. So thank you for attending. I hope this was useful. I hope it started to spark some ideas of things you can do in your APIs, either from the point of view of Hypermedia or from the point of view of shaping your JSON and shaping your outputs with Jackson, and basically getting a much lighter, and more specific type of information over the wire. So hopefully all of this was useful. Thank you for attending. And if there are any questions, of course, everything on the screen is for further questions. If you have other questions, just ping me on Twitter, email me, or through the blog. Thank you, and enjoy the conference.